Donald Trump's announcement today that he was picking Ben Carson to head up the Department of Housing and Urban Development is a really bad sign if you want that department to be able to accomplish anything approaching its historic mission to aid people in the cities in being able to afford housing and not have their houses foreclosed on in outlying areas as well. And it also says something about the Republican Party, although I think in this particular case, it says a little bit less about Trump specifically, because his pick of Ben Carson, as random as it may seem, as ridiculous on its face as it may seem, is actually, once you look into it, pretty in line with the standard Republican tactic for making government as inefficient and ineffective as possible. And so, first of all, it's of course ridiculous that he's choosing this man to be in his cabinet when he was mocking him on the campaign trail for obviously making up the stories about trying to stab someone in a belt buckle blocking it, and how he was attacking every member in his family in an attempt to kill them at one point or another. That fictional story that Ben Carson has come up with to explain how he went from a savage young black man to the relatively intelligent and successful surgeon that he ended up being. In that particular case, I think Trump was somewhat right to attack him. And then he brings him in. And that is a problem, because Ben Carson is a man who is an author at this point, not fictional, I would say, a very successful surgeon, and a guy who ran for president and failed. And now he's going to head up the Department of Housing and Urban Development. In what way, in what possible universe could you say that his life experience had made him qualified to run any federal department? But this one in particular, none. There is no defense for that. His closest family members couldn't defend that. His best friend couldn't defend that. He was a surgeon. Perhaps at some point he had a couple of employees underneath him. Maybe he had a small payroll. Okay, maybe on the campaign trail he had a few workers, although we know that his campaign during the primary was in somewhat of an infantile state. The idea that he now is going to be responsible for close to 10,000 employees and a budget of up near $50 billion? Does anyone think that that is anything but a recipe for disaster? No, and I'm including the right wing there, because they do think it's a recipe for disaster, but it's a disaster that they are wholeheartedly embracing. Now, philosophically, he's not just in preparation, not prepared to actually do the job, not qualified to run it and to manage all those employees. But he's also philosophically set up to put a very Trumpian, conservative Republican idea of what the government should be trying to accomplish into play with HUD. And so he's previously said that government programs like those managed at HUD encourage dependency and are just engaging in social engineering. And that's interesting, because HUD has a very particular mission in place for itself. It oversees programs that provide vouchers and other rental assistance for 5 million low-income families, the people who need it most, fights urban blight, and helps struggling homeowners stave off foreclosures. That is an incredibly important position that it has, that runs directly contrary to everything he says he stands for philosophically. Those 5 million families are not just happy to get the rent assistance, they rely on it to not lose their homes, which is, of course, the first domino in families being destroyed in many cases. They need that money, and he is against them getting it. Now, in terms of the preparation, he doesn't have the actual job experience, and he even seems to acknowledge that. He did say, though, that he was prepared to leave the agency because he grew up in the inner city. And because as a physician in Baltimore, he has dealt with a lot of patients from that area. That response is what you would expect from an extremely racist white conservative. I have some experience with them blacks from the inner city. Of course I can run this department of 10,000 employees, who has a mission that encompasses 50 different states and dozens of billions of different dollars in its budget every year. And he says that simply because he served some of those people as a surgeon, he's prepared. But perhaps, much more scarily, he said, we the people have the responsibility to take care of the indigent in our society. But you'll note there that he is not talking about the government's role in helping out those people. He's talking about churches helping those people. Because, of course, churches are going to help to provide rent for 5 million people. He said it's not the government's job. And that is incredibly scary, because it is both the government's job and now his job. and 5 million plus people. I mean, that's families. That's any number of people. 20 million, 30 million people rely every day on the services that the Department of Housing and Urban Development has provided for them for literally decades. And he is not prepared nor willing to fill that role in the way that it should be filled. And Trump has done what any conservative president would do in this case, is put someone in who is intended to fail. And if they fail, they will say that it is not their fault and it's not their philosophy's fault. It's the people who needed the service's fault. That they didn't stand up for themselves, they weren't strong enough, they weren't active enough, proactive I should say, and they'll blame them. And when it fails, and when those families are cast out into the street, it will be their fault, or perhaps Obama's fault at that point. And this is another one of those things where I said before the election that there is a massive difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and that a center-right Democrat, if you want to say, is substantially better in a way that will directly affect the life quality of any number of different people. When those families are destroyed, when they're cast out on the street, they will know the difference between a center-right Democrat and Donald freaking Trump. Many of them probably voted for Hillary Clinton in the first place. Here I'm more targeting people who tried to set up the easy, ridiculous, false equivalence between the two. Their lives are going to be hurt. And many of the people who were calling for you to vote for effectively Donald Trump, or specifically for Donald Trump, they're not the ones who rely on these vouchers from HUD. They don't need it. They're going to be okay. But we were warning ahead of time that many of the people who will be hurt the most by Donald Trump and his policies, they don't have time for these fun little games that people like to play in the media. And now they're going to be hurting with Ben Carson as the head of HUD.